Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 3 lecture. So, just kind of concluding our point about some of the differences and similarities between novels and short stories. One thing to look for when you're reading our short stories for this week, you'll notice that because of their shorter length, short stories will often tackle sort of one big event, or they'll often center around one key character. Whereas novels, as we can imagine, they have a bigger scope, right? They have a bigger canvas. So there's more characters, there's more big narrative events, more is happening, more time is passing, right? But in a short story, we have that smaller time frame in terms of getting the story told. So a lot of times we start maybe a little bit closer to the climax. Maybe we have a smaller cast of characters. We don't have as many different settings. And maybe the plot is less complex, less elaborate than what we would find in novels. But that's not always the case. Some short stories feel pretty big, and some short stories can actually be pretty long. We don't have a lot of hard and fast rules as far as like what is the maximum length requirement like for a short story, like how long can a short story be. Typically, once you're getting close to 100 pages, we're going to typically call that story a novella or a novelette. Some people would even call it a short novel. Some people think a novella and a short novel are different. There's a lot of different definitions and classifications. You don't have to worry about it, but typically long short stories can get up to 50, maybe 60 pages. A more standard length might be somewhere between 10 to maybe 20 or 25, but we're also going to find a lot of short ones, 5, 6 pages, maybe even less. So a popular novella would be something like Heart of Darkness, which maybe some of you had to read in high school. That's like around 100 pages. And then once you get closer to maybe 150 or 200 pages, that's just a novel. Some people might distinguish it as a short novel, but still a novel. So those are kind of the general levels that we observe. And just to finish with the history of the short story, one thing to keep in mind, we're talking about the sort of growth and development of the modern world a little bit here, because novels and short stories really coincide, like we were saying before, with all of these other changes and advancements that were happening in the world during the 16, 17, and 1800s. Again, sort of the growth of what we now think of as the modern world, the world that we all live in. So another thing that was developing during that same time was newspapers. Of course, we kind of take newspapers for granted now. We don't really read them anymore. Maybe we read some online, but you guys know that for a very long time, newspapers were an important part of media, and they really developed over the course of the 1700s and the 1800s, kind of along with novels and short stories. And back in the 1800s, a lot of American newspapers and magazines would often carry short stories. That was a big part of how short stories developed. They would often be published in magazines like Harper's or Saturday Evening Post. Even to this day, the New Yorker will often feature short stories. Other newspapers, other periodicals like magazines that will have news and like pop culture stuff, they might also publish a little bit of fiction, usually short fiction, because you can't always fit a novel in there. But back in the old days, a lot of novels would be published serially. Back in the 1800s, that means they would be published in installments, because you would only get the paper, you might get it every day, but they would only publish an installment maybe once a week. So kind of like a show back when we still had cable and the time that shows came on mattered. Like my parents, when I was young, you'd have to be in front of the TV every week, Thursday night, at whatever time, to see what happened next. That was how serial novels worked back in the 1800s. And again, they would often appear in newspapers. and magazines. And then short stories a little later on, they came to appear in those same places. So as the newspapers got bigger, short stories and to some extent novels also rose in popularity. They were all kind of connected. They were all these new types of media that were developing as the world modernized. And again, we still see short stories in those places, but you'll also often see short stories in collections that are put out by publishing companies. And of course, a lot of short stories can now be found online on various literary websites, literary journals or magazines. So they're kind of everywhere. I don't think people read short stories quite as much as they read novels, but I think that gap is probably closing. So again, as we take a look at the short stories this week, you might want to do a little bit of comparison. I'm assuming we've all read a novel at some point in our lives. So think about a novel that you've read and kind of keep it alongside the short stories that you're reading. You'll notice a few differences. Again, with the short stories, maybe a little bit less character development, fewer characters, a little bit less description from the narrator. You might notice that there might just be a single narrative perspective or point of view, whereas sometimes in a novel we'll get multiple perspectives or points of view. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So just think about some of the differences, but also think about some of the similarities, because again, a lot of the same elements that we find in novels are also going to be functioning in short stories. So let's go through some of our key elements of fiction. This should mostly be review, I would imagine, for most of us, because we've learned about these terms before. Maybe in high school, maybe even earlier, because we start reading stories at a pretty early age. So we're pretty familiar, I think, with most of these elements, but we sometimes need to kind of update our understanding, because the way that we use them in high school or middle school isn't always sufficient for the kind of work that we're doing now at this level. So again, get these down in your notes. You can kind of use the book or you can use me now. And I want us to all sort of use the same definitions. I want us to use all of these elements in kind of the same ways. I mean, not use them the same, but understand them the same. You guys can do whatever you want with them when you're conducting analysis, but I want us to all work with the same definitions, the same basic understanding of what these elements are. Okay, starting with plot. We all know what the plot is. This is the sequence of events, the events that unfold in the story. What happens? What takes place? The plot's going to vary depending on what type of fiction you are experiencing. With a lot of shows and movies, we might call them plot heavy. A lot's happening. This is certainly true with detective fiction or police procedurals, cop dramas, but also like action movies. A lot of the Marvel stuff, those very elaborate plots, right? There's a lot happening. We have to keep up with all of the different events, okay? But then with other types of fiction, not as much happens. And we're sometimes tempted to call stories where not a lot happens, we're sometimes tempted to say, oh, there's no plot. It's just people sitting around talking or going to work. But I would argue that there's always a plot. There's always a plot. But sometimes it might just be a very uneventful plot. It's just, hey, this guy goes to work, this guy goes to his friend's house, talks to somebody, walks his dog, whatever. But there's always events. There's always things happening. But the nature of those things will vary depending on what genre we're looking at and depending on what kind of story it is. But there's always going to be some kind of sequence of events. And traditionally, we have what we call the plot triangle. You guys may have seen this before. It's kind of a way to identify the basic stages of a typical plot. So these are the stages that you're going to find in most stories, but I want to emphasize this. You guys will notice this. Not all stories use all of the traditional stages of plot. They don't. There's no rule that says that you have to. A lot of this stuff that we think about with plot and the plot triangle really comes from drama and Aristotle and ancient Greece, where they were first sort of defining a lot of things that we consider to be central to narrative storytelling. But they didn't really have prose fiction. They had narrative poetry and they had drama. So they were largely focusing on those literary genres. So when we talk about fiction and the plot triangle, there can be a lot of room for interpretation, and some writers are going to leave out certain parts of the classic plot triangle, whereas others will be more faithful to it. But typically the way we think of it, the first stage is exposition. And this is a word that you might hear me say a little bit. I've posted a link so you guys can take a look at the plot triangle and see all of these stages written out. But the exposition is basically what you find at the beginning of a lot of stories. And it's just sort of like background information. It's a lot of important info that's being delivered by the narrator of the story. And it's like stuff that the reader needs to know before getting into the actual events of the plot. So, again, not all stories use exposition, much or at all. Sometimes we don't have exposition at all. We're just thrown into the middle of a scene or the middle of some kind of action. But again, a lot of traditionally constructed stories will start out with some exposition, telling the reader a little bit about characters or telling the reader a little bit about the setting, kind of getting the reader oriented. Where are we in this story? What's the time period? What's the setting? Tell me a little bit about this character that I'm about to meet. Kind of what's going on with him. Like how old is he? What does he look like? Basic info. Again, not all authors will give us that up front, but a lot of authors do. And sometimes they might do it briefly, just a couple of sentences, just giving us some basic info. And sometimes this will actually be done by another character, especially if we have a first-person narrator, right? Oftentimes the protagonist of the story might be telling the story, and then they might provide the exposition for us. But sometimes they can do it in an interesting, kind of fun way, and we don't even realize that we're getting exposition because it might be delivered through some other means, some other way. But this is just a way for us to kind of know what's going on in the story before we get into the story. Where are we? What's happening? Who is this person? Basic stuff. So exposition is stage one. And then we have what's often called rising action. So again, if we're thinking about a triangle, right, the exposition's on the ground, and then we start going up the triangle, and that's the rising action. And usually, so that's just like the plot's underway. Things are happening. The characters are doing things, okay? And at this point, there's usually going to be some kind of conflict introduced. Now, again, don't always think about conflict like two people fighting or some kind of big dramatic thing. Sometimes conflict can be very mundane. It doesn't always have to be person versus person. There can be all kinds of different conflicts. Internal conflicts, like a character is just struggling with something inside themselves, fear, guilt, insecurity. It can be a conflict with nature. It can be a conflict with society. It can be conflict with an animal. There's all kinds of different conflicts. But yeah, the way that we often think about it is we have our protagonist, right? Our main character. And that character's often trying to accomplish something. They're trying to get something. And then there might be an antagonist, right? The bad guy, the villain, to use our kind of elementary terminology, the bad guy opposes the good guy, right? The bad guy is trying to prevent the good guy from accomplishing the mission, achieving the goal, or acquiring whatever it is the protagonist wants. That's often how we think of conflict, but that's not always how conflict appears in fiction. But there's going to be some kind of conflict. You can't have much of a plot without conflict. There has to be some kind of obstacle or barrier that's separating the main character from what they want or what they need. Okay, so that conflict gets introduced during the rising action. And then there's usually some form of like complication, right? Something happens. It might be a bad thing, it might be a good thing, but often the character's situation might change. The main character, might be thrust into some kind of new environment where they have to adjust and learn. Or, that might not happen, but perhaps the character is just dealing with some everyday problem. I don't want to go to work. I want to ask this person out, but I don't know if they're interested, right? It doesn't have to be life or death. It doesn't have to be, saving the world from a supervillain. There can still be a lot of conflicts and complications that develop just in a normal day. Right? I want to go hang out with my friends, but my mom wants me to do my laundry or whatever. I mean, that is a viable complication that also introduces conflict for the character, and he has to figure out what he's going to do about it. So that's all happening during the rising action. And oftentimes the complication that gets introduced, or the conflict that the main character has to deal with, it's going to eventually lead to the climax. And the climax is the turning point. It's the point of like the highest tension. It's when the action hits the apex. But as we're going to notice, not all fiction has easily identifiable climaxes. Again, in the traditional sort of, older storytelling where we have a hero trying to overcome obstacles, the climax is going to be a big battle, or it's going to be hand-to-hand combat, or it's going to be some kind of death-defying experience, but it doesn't always have to look like that. Right? But it's just the point where that conflict comes to a head. It's the point where that complication forces something to change. Something has to happen. This is the boiling point. This is the point where something, whether it's going to be good or bad or somewhere in between, something is going to kind of explode here. And that's going to dictate how the story ends. But the climax is not the ending. It's not the ending. In the traditional plot triangle, we have one final stage of the plot, and that is the resolution, sometimes called the denouement, which is the French term. But it's just the way the story gets resolved. It's the conclusion. It's the way everything gets tied up, the loose ends get wrapped up. Again, if we're thinking about movies, the sort of traditional movie structure will, kind of like with classic movies, but even like a lot of superhero movies, will have a brief resolution. It might just be like a single scene after the big climactic battle, which is very stressful and violent, right? But the heroes emerge victorious. That's how it usually works. And then we have that final scene where maybe they're all kind of hanging out. Things are a little bit more lighthearted. They've come through the worst of it. Maybe some of them are kind of injured and they're making jokes about their injuries. Like, we've all seen a scene like that. That's the resolution, right? We kind of see what's next for the characters. Right? Now that the big conflict has been resolved, now that everything has kind of been tied up, what are they going to do next? If it's a serial, right, something that has reoccurring installments like those old novels or contemporary MCU stuff, like, we're going to see the next movie, right? But in a lot of fiction, we might not ever return to these characters. If there's not going to be a sequel, we're never going to come back to them. So the resolution can often give us as readers some closure. Like, okay, this is what they're going to do for the rest of their lives. This is how things are going to turn out for these characters. These two are going to get married. She's going to do this. This kid's going to grow up and become a fireman or whatever, right? We get some glance, some indication of what's next for the characters. Even if we're going to get the sequel, we still want to have an idea of what's next for them. So we usually wrap up with a resolution, but again, remember, not all fiction sticks to those traditional stages. So some stories are going to just completely lop off the resolution. They might not have exposition. And again, with short stories, because of their shorter length, sometimes we have to cut back on the rising action. Or we have to, like I said before, we might start the story pretty close to the climax because it might be a 5-page story. So we have to resolve the conflict pretty quickly. So we might not have a whole lot of rising action, or we might not have time for much resolution after the climax. The climax might be hard to locate. You might have to really kind of look for it and think about it. But generally, you'll be able to find at least some of those stages in almost any work of fiction, no matter what length you're dealing with. There's going to be some kind of a plot, and it's going to have some kind of conflict fueling it. And then you might be able to locate some other of those stages as well. Another thing to consider if we're thinking about sequence, the way the plot unfolds. Think about sequence. Do we have flashbacks? Do we have flash forwards? Or other examples of what we would call foreshadowing, like hints, little signs or indications of what's going to happen later in the plot. We often find those in fiction. So these are just different kinds of breaks in a linear chronological narrative. If we have a flashback, we're going back in time, right? We're going back to a previous point, maybe even before the point at which the story started. And then sometimes we might move ahead in time. So just think about sequence. All plots have a sequence. And traditional plots will often go in chronological order. That means from start to finish, from the first event to the last event, but not always. A lot of plots do not follow a chronological order, and we might be jumping around in time quite a bit. So just keep that in mind and look for that. Be ready to talk about that when you're analyzing short stories. What kind of plot sequence are we dealing with? You need to be able to identify it in anything that you write. Okay, so let's move on to our next key element. So plot is our first element. Our second is character. Obviously, with short stories, with novels, and also with plays, and frequently even in poetry, we're going to have characters. So this is a literary element that really applies to virtually all types of literature. But obviously, we're going to meet a lot of characters in short stories and novels. So these are simply the people who inhabit the stories that we're reading. Generally speaking, characters can be kind of classified into two groups. We can think about character types, and we can think about individualized characters. So you may have learned the phrases or the terms flat characters versus round characters at some previous point in your educational lives. We can still use those terms. So a flat character is a character type. They're not well developed. They're not really made into individuals. They just represent types of people. So you guys have all seen characters like this. The jock, the cheerleader, the nerd, right? I mean, if you've ever seen anything depicting like school life or, teenagers, you've run into character types, right? And we see it in all genres. So character types are not always meant to be super realistic. Like they might not always be meant to like mirror a real person. Sometimes they're kind of over the top. They're kind of made almost absurd, or they're kind of being made fun of in certain instances. But they're supposed to be a stand-in for an entire type of person. And you can see just by my description that can be a little dangerous sometimes. And I think one thing that a lot of young adult fiction and teen dramas are doing now, one thing that they're doing now is sort of playing around with those types, like sort of interrogating character types that used to be very commonly found in these types of fiction, and kind of exploring like, hey, maybe these people are more complex than we gave them credit for. You can't just, reduce a person to jock or nerd or, whatever, the overachiever, the popular girl, whatever. Those types are kind of inadequate in a lot of ways. They don't capture how people really are. So a lot of times when we meet characters that don't seem well developed, they don't feel like individuals, they just feel like types, we often call them flat characters, and we often don't find them as effective or as compelling as round characters, because round characters are individuals. They have a lot of different traits. Some are good, some are bad. Like most people, they're not all good and they're not all bad, right? They like certain things. They might fall into certain cliques or certain camps based on their interests or, their talents, but they're individuals, right? They're complicated just like all real people are. So we tend to prefer round characters because they're more complex and because they have specific personality traits that we can often recognize. This is where a lot of the relatability comes in. We like to be able to relate to certain characters. And how do we do that? Well, we recognize character traits that maybe we possess, or maybe a character reminds us of our best friend or our sister, somebody else that we know. And that makes us feel kind of close to that character, or it might even make us feel like we can kind of understand that character because we know people who are kind of like that character. We know people who have some of those personality traits. So, yeah, we tend to go for round characters. And again, novels and short stories really helped to create more individualized characters. Because again, a lot of older kinds of literature wasn't really doing that. We mentioned how with the ancient epics, again, we had character types because they were trying to express these bigger ideas. They were allegories, kind of representing these bigger thoughts and concepts. So the characters were not always super round. It was just the hero, the damsel, the good king, the bad king, right? Because it wasn't always about creating recognizable individuals. It was about expressing larger ideas. But when novels and short stories came around, like the ideas were more about everyday life and real individualized people. And we tend to prefer that brand of literature today. Again, that's partly why short stories and novels are so popular, because it seems like they can really express a lot of truths that we can all relate to, no matter where we live, no matter what we believe, no matter who we are, because it's life, it's people, and we can all relate on some level. So we get very different characters in fiction. They're often going to seem more like real people. And also fiction will often rely more on showing us things, perhaps more so than just telling us. Although there's going to be a balance. So a lot of times narrators are going to tell us things about characters. And sometimes characters might also tell us things about themselves. Or one character might tell us things about another character. But we often think that the most skillful fiction writers can tell us a lot by showing, right? By sort of, if we can observe the character's actions, if we can listen to the characters talk, we're often going to learn about them that way too. And that often feels more organic, sort of more authentic than just having the narrator tell us everything. So in school, you may have heard, if you've ever had to do a little bit of creative writing in school, you might have heard your teacher say, show, don't tell. Don't always tell the reader everything. That gets kind of boring. That just becomes like one big summary, basically. You want to sometimes show them through the character's actions, through the character's words. We want to show the audience who these characters are. Okay, so let's move on. Point of view is our third element. We can also call this like the perspective through which the narrative is told. So we all know this, right? It's kind of an instinctive understanding, but let's think more about it. All stories are getting told to us by some kind of a narrator. So there's always going to be a particular point of view, the narrative point of view. Who is telling the story? Okay, whose perspective are we getting as the readers? So you guys have probably learned about the basic types of point of view. So let's just go through the major kinds. There's a lot, but there's a handful that we're going to see the most often. Starting with our omniscient third-person narrator. You guys have probably heard of this type before. An omniscient third-person narrator is all-knowing. Omniscient means all-knowing. This is a God-like narrator who is not one of the characters of the story. Okay? An omniscient third-person narrator is like above the story. So if we imagine the story down here, the omniscient third-person narrator is like God. He's up above, observing what's going on and telling the story, but not participating in it. Okay? And an omniscient third-person narrator knows everything about the characters. Again, all-knowing. So you can usually get a feel pretty early on as to whether or not you're dealing with an omniscient third-person narrator. They're going to refer to characters in the third person. He did that. She did that. Sam went to the store, right? So you get the third-person voice. You also get a lot of knowledge with the omniscient third-person narrator because, again, they can tell you basically anything about any character. So this kind of narrator will often give you at least some exposition, maybe not a lot, but they can tell you what happened in the past, what this character's thinking about, what that character's doing right now. They have access, conceivably, to all of the character's thoughts and feelings, but we still might focus primarily on one character. We still might be focusing primarily on our protagonist, our main character. But an omniscient third-person narrator can really tell us virtually anything because they are all-knowing, all-seeing. So they certainly will know a lot more than the individual characters will know. All right, so we're going to experience some omniscient third-person narration, but the style that we might see the most often today, it's kind of up for debate, but it's certainly very popular, is the first-person narrative point of view. Okay, so that means usually it means the protagonist or the main character is talking. First person. That means I did this. This happened to me. So oftentimes what we have with the first person, we have the main character telling his or her own story. Okay, so this is going to be a very different style. With a first person narrative point of view, that's not all-knowing. That's not omniscient like that omniscient third-person narrator. So a first-person narrator can't necessarily get into the heads of other characters. If I'm the main character of the story and I'm telling the story, I don't necessarily know what other characters are thinking unless I have some supernatural abilities. I don't really know what this character did yesterday if I wasn't with her. So there are some limitations to what the narrator can share with the audience. And usually the focus is going to be more on what happened to me. What did I do? What did I experience? What did I think? What did I feel? What did I say? All right, but a lot of other stuff is happening as well, of course. But again, we're thinking about the point of view, okay? The perspective. What perspective is the story told through? Often with first person, the perspective will be the perspective of the main character. But not always. Sometimes we're going to get a first person perspective from a different character, not necessarily the protagonist. So this is kind of weird, but sometimes we can have a minor character. Not the main character, but like a minor character, somebody who is involved in the action, but they're not the star. But maybe they're telling the story. This isn't as common anymore, but if you guys have read The Great Gatsby, if you've ever read Moby Dick, those novels make use of this kind of narrative point of view, because the narrator of Moby Dick is Ishmael. He's not the main character, really, but he's there for all of the main events of the plot, and he's telling the story. And sometimes he does use the first-person pronoun. I did this. Somebody was talking to me. But he mostly focuses on what other people do. And that's what Nick Carraway does in The Great Gatsby. Nick is our narrator, not Gatsby, right? The story isn't told from the perspective of Gatsby, and that matters because Gatsby is an enigma. He's mysterious. He wouldn't be able to stay as mysterious if he's telling the story, because he would probably tell us all about him. No, Nick tells the story. And Nick is a character. He's involved. He's there at the parties. He's hanging out, but he's not the star, right? He's a minor character, and he's telling the story. So that's a different style of first person. That's not the dominant style that we usually see, where the narrator is the main character, or at least one of the main characters, right? Often, with a lot of contemporary fiction, a lot of popular fiction today, the narrator will be the main character, the protagonist. But sometimes we can get first-person narration from other characters. But again, remember the difference. The third-person omniscient narrator is up here, separate from the action. A first-person narrator is in the action, involved. That's very different. Okay, and then we're also going to find some other types of third-person narration. Okay, so not all first-person narration is the same, not all third-person is the same. Not all third-person narrators are omniscient. A lot of them are, and in older types of fiction, like classic novels, even going back to epic poetry, those third-person narrators were always omniscient. They knew everything. But now, in more modern stuff, we might sometimes find a third-person narrator, okay? Not a character, not somebody who's on the ground level, somebody separate, but it's a third-person narrator that might be somewhat limited, right? They don't know everything. They're not godlike. So they're separate from the action, and they also might kind of recede from view. They might kind of just like blend into the background, and you don't even really notice the narrator all that much. And that's an interesting thing to observe. With a sort of limited third-person narrator, it often feels like we don't even have a narrator at all, because the focus is on the characters, what they're doing, what they're saying. So the plot is largely revealed through the actions and words of the characters, not the words and observations of the narrator, of the third-person narrator. So a lot of those old omniscient third-person narrators were very intrusive. Like, they were always kind of passing judgment on the characters, telling us things about the characters. But a more limited third-person narrator that's not omniscient, they're not going to be doing all of that, right? They're going to let the characters largely speak for themselves. This is a more modern style, and I've actually posted some examples of what you find in a lot of limited third-person narration. It's given rise to a lot of more modern fiction techniques that we see a lot in contemporary literature today, like stream of consciousness, interior monologue, and one of my favorites, which is free indirect discourse. I'm not going to get into those right now, but if you're interested, I've posted examples and explanations of all of those in the week 3 module. But these are just all techniques that you're often going to find with more limited third-person narration. Again, the story's not being told by any of the characters, but it sometimes feels that way because the narrator is so unobtrusive. The third-person narrator is so quiet and not really drawing any attention to themselves that it almost feels like the narrator's voice is maybe the same as the characters' voices. And we almost feel like, again, the characters are driving the ship, not the narrator. So we see that more and more in more contemporary stuff. So if you're interested in that, check out my examples. If you're not that interested, just remember the 3 basic kinds of point of view. Omniscient third person, that's the godlike narrator who knows everything. A limited third person, okay, again, somebody that's not in the story, but they're not omniscient, and they're just kind of hanging and letting everybody in the story do most of the work, okay? And then we have first person, which is often delivered from the main character or the protagonist, but sometimes first person narration can come from minor characters as well. And the final thing to remember, because we're going to see it this week, and it's weird, it's a lot less commonly used, and that is second person narrative style, or the second person point of view. This is when you is like the writer is addressing you, the second person pronoun. And the you in the text is kind of the presumed reader of the text. This is a weird point of view. We don't see it as much, but you're going to see it this week with The Thing Around Your Neck by Chimamanda Adichie. So you'll notice it right away. The narrator keeps saying, you did this, you did that. We're never quite sure who the you is. We learn a lot about the person. We never actually meet the person, but the story is written like the you that Adichie's narrator is addressing. The you is the person who she's writing to. And that's supposed to be the person who's reading it. But of course, we are reading it, but we can either put ourselves in the shoes of the person that the narrator is addressing, or we can just think of ourselves as observing this relationship. The narrator is writing this story to the you addressed in the story, and we can think more about the relationship between the two of them as we read. So we don't see a whole lot of second person point of view, but because Adichie uses it, and I really like her, and I like that story, I just wanted to mention it. You're not going to see it a ton, but you'll see it there. So think about it and think about how it's different from any kind of first person or any kind of third person point of view. All right, let's speed it up here. I don't want this lecture to be too long. So setting. We already know what setting is, okay? The location, the historical period, and maybe some of the social surroundings or circumstances that are all going to be important to a story. So I always tell readers to think about setting on 2 levels, okay? Geographical and historical. So obviously, where are we? We always want to know that, and we might not always learn that. But most stories take place in a particular geographical location, a particular city, a particular state, a particular country, a particular planet. It could be any number of different things, but we usually have a sort of physical or geographical location. And then what we have also, the other level is what we could call historical or temporal, just meaning relating to time. Like, where are we in time? Does the story take place in the present day, like right now? Or does it take place in the past, some past historical period? Or does it take place in the future? If we're reading sci-fi or fantasy, it might be set several centuries in the future. Now, again, not all stories will tell us exactly where we are geographically or where we are in terms of time. But we should always look for the information that is provided. Sometimes the exposition will tell us a lot about the setting. In other cases, the setting gets revealed slowly just through what characters say and do and through some of the description that we might get from our narrator. But you always need to think about setting as much as possible. Another key term that we have to know is theme. Another word you guys have learned before, theme. This is the larger idea or message or the meaning that is being expressed by the story. We all learn about theme at a pretty early age, and we're encouraged to always find the overall theme of a story. Sometimes it can be hard to figure out what the theme is, and a lot of times when we're analyzing and interpreting, largely what we're doing is we're kind of wrestling with theme and all of the different thematic sort of things that are bouncing around. We're trying to make sense of them and explain them in our own words, and we're trying to provide our own understanding of what the story is trying to express. So the theme will often be an abstract concept, like the book says, or like a larger idea that's being brought to life by the text. So the book mentions some stuff like war, love, death, as sort of like general themes. And yeah, I would agree, but what you have to do with those themes is figure out what the story is saying about them, right? What does the author want us to understand about these larger abstract concepts like love or whatever? What's the larger importance? What are we supposed to understand about that concept or about that idea? And how is all of that expressed and made clear to us in the text? We always have to wrestle with those questions, especially when we're trying to interpret literature. So again, some themes are really big. They're like life and death. They're about human nature or the course of human history. And then other themes are kind of smaller, and maybe they might feel more low stakes, but they're still going to be important or significant in their own ways. So there's going to be a lot of different themes. It's up to you as the reader to make sense of them. And then just very quickly, symbolism, that's when objects, people, or images represent larger ideas or sort of, abstract concepts, like some of the ones that we were just talking about. So again, symbolism has always been a part of literature, and it was even more prominent in some of that older, ancient literature, but we still see symbolism all the time in novels, short stories, and we're going to see it a lot in poetry as well. So sometimes, like the book says, flowers maybe are just flowers in the story. They don't necessarily always have to represent something larger, but you have to figure it out. So like the example they give in the book, if you're reading the story by John Steinbeck, The Chrysanthemums, then clearly those are flowers. Clearly those flowers have some symbolic importance in that story, and you need to make sense of that. But you might come to the conclusion that some objects are just there because, they're in the room and they don't have larger importance, but some do. Some objects, some, small items, especially if they get repeated, if they reappear in the text. And remember, symbols can be almost anything. They can be objects. They might even be places. They might even be, animals. But they're often inanimate objects that have some kind of importance in the text. All right, and then the final one is style. And I want us to think a little bit about style this week as we start looking at our examples of fiction. So we're really thinking about tone and language here. So you get to decide on what styles you like and what styles are working for you as you read our various works of literature throughout the semester. So think about how the authors write. Think about their use of language. Think about their tone. What does their writing sound like? What does it feel like? Okay, what emotions does it evoke in you? Is it sad? Is it lighthearted? Is it formal? A lot of times older literature might feel formal to us because the language is different. It might feel stiff. A lot of big words that we don't use anymore. Old-fashioned sentence structure, right? There's a certain formality that we might detect there, whereas a lot of contemporary literature might feel, informal, more like the way people really talk, the way people really express themselves today. So is it formal or is it casual? Does the text make you feel good? Does it make you feel happy? Or does it make you feel something else? Also, think about diction. That just means word choice. The choices the author is making about which words and phrases to use. Think about word choice. Is the author using a lot of big words? Do you have to go to an online dictionary and look up words, which you absolutely should do if you ever come across a word that you don't know? Or are there a lot of pretty short, simple, familiar words that, again, might contribute to a more casual, informal tone and style? Think about the length of sentences. Are there a lot of long sentences here, or are they shorter and easier to read? Also, think about paragraph length. Are the paragraphs really long? That can get a little bit difficult to make your way through a lot of long paragraphs. Or are they shorter, quicker, kind of easier to manage? And finally, think about, once again, the characters, but think about how the characters talk. Think about how the characters are speaking in the dialogue that you're often going to see in short stories and novels. Dialogue's just when we literally hear characters talking to one another. And if a character's talking to him or herself, that's a monologue. And we'll sometimes find that too. But dialogue's very common, right? We talk to people all the time, every day. I'm talking to you right now. But this, is remote dialogue. So, of course, in our modern lives, we are often talking remotely. We're often talking while separated from big distance, by large distances. But we're still communicating, and that's always going to be a staple of any work of fiction. There's going to be if there's characters, then they're going to be probably communicating in some way. So we should always think about the dialogue. How do the characters talk? And sometimes we judge characters in large part based on how they talk. When we're determining if they seem realistic, authentic, a lot of that's based on how they sound. Do they sound like real people? Or do they sound unrealistic? And that might alienate us. Do they sound formal? Do they sound old-timey? What do we think about these characters? A lot of that will be based on the character's speech. Okay, so think about the styles of these three authors that we're reading this week. So I already mentioned Adichie, The Thing Around Your Neck. Adichie's a Nigerian-American writer. She was born in Nigeria, but came to the U.S. for college. And I believe she lives in both places. But she's a pretty popular novelist. And I just really like her style. So I'm interested to see if you guys agree. She's the one using that weird second person point of view. Also, we're reading Ted Chiang's The Great Silence. That's a very weird story, has some flavor of sci-fi. Think about the point of view of that story. I don't want to give it away. I'm assuming a lot of you haven't read it yet. And then finally, Fiesta 1980 by Diaz. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of Diaz, but like Adichie, he's pretty well known in literary circles. He's written a lot of celebrated short stories and novels. A lot of them are largely autobiographical. So again, Diaz is one of these writers who a little bit blurs the line, like we were saying before, between fiction and nonfiction, because he's making up new characters and new situations, but a lot of the stuff in his fiction is based on his own life, growing up as a Dominican American kid in New Jersey. So a lot of real life kind of shows up in his text, even though he's still considered to be a fiction writer. So again, he has a style that a lot of young people like. Let me just preface it by saying that, because his characters feel real. He uses a very casual sort of writing style that a lot of students like. I've taught Diaz for years because a lot of my students like his style. I'm interested to see if you guys like it as well. It's never bad to disagree with me or others. You don't have to like something just because I like it or just because other people like it. Your mission is to find some literature that you like. All right, and style is a big part of that. So enjoy the stories. I'll talk about them very briefly next week before we jump into poetry. So I will see you then.